Hi, Doug Mealy here from Safer Handling, and welcome to this week's episode of This week we're in Palma, Mallorca.
Previously on Day Live.
In last week's episode, we delved into Section 6 requirements. Now, although we were talking about a snail and a ginger beer bottle, and I was using this to prove the point of why we shouldn't get restraint equipment and accept it with anything less than full training, legal, medical and tactical reviews, it also brought to light acts versus omissions. So that's where we're responsible for not just the things we do, but the things we fail to do. Now, this is especially prevalent where we look at the act of restricting liberty or containing someone rather than restraining them.
Let's get into the episode.
So the age-old question of, can I lock a door or create a barrier to prevent a child from leaving a room or a part of a building? Now, we touched on this in the first episode, if I'm right in thinking, because there was a request within a document which called for a ban on seclusion and a ban on restraint. Now, if we start banning one thing, then we create a vacuum and something gets overused. Where I've worked in different countries, I've seen data which has said, look, we've brought down restraints. And then when I've actually visited facilities, I've seen that the medication is through the roof, or people are boasting saying, oh, we don't use mechanical restraint at all, but everyone's in seclusion, everybody's isolated. So when we look into the guidance around this and legislation, Children's Home Guidance, Children Act, there's plenty of information out there that gives us a framework for containing or restricting liberty. And one of the things we should always ask ourselves is, what's less intrusive? Is it us putting our hands on a young person's limbs who doesn't want to be held as they struggle and try and fight and break free? Or might it be less intrusive, ethical, and more lawful if we can contain rather than restrain? Now, that doesn't mean locking somebody in a cupboard or locking them into a room where they're going to be panicked. It might be locking down certain areas. So if the child is going down a corridor and they're going to go into a reception class or a kitchen or somewhere where there might be weapons or hot liquids and things like that, then maybe we need to restrict access. Key fob systems tend to have replaced bolts, but if you look at the quote here from Lord Laming, where he talks about it being reasonable to bolt a door whilst you win time to call for help.
And although Ofsted inspectors shouldn't be commenting on individual systems of physical intervention, they do receive training around restriction of liberty. And from correspondence with Ofsted, they've been quite clear that there's no legal restriction preventing this.
One of the things I've heard people say is, oh, well, yeah, we never lock doors. So then I give the example of, what if you need to stop somebody from gaining access? They'll say, okay, well, we would block the doorway. That's putting yourself in harm's way. And if you then fail, the child will continue with that behaviour. So that's not always appropriate. Sometimes it's appropriate where it's only necessary to use that level of force, or we can use low-level interventions to guide, shepherd or hold someone. I'm completely on board with that. But if it's a case of somebody who's stronger and more physically able, even just during that circumstance, a staff member who's holding the door closed, thinking that it's unlawful to bolt it or have a key fob on it, well, they're undertaking a hazardous manual handling activity. And we're told in our ACOPS, approved codes of practice, that we should automate or mechanize manual handling activities. So what's a mechanical way of holding a door closed? It's a bolt, it's a key fob, or it's a lock. What I'd like to see is doors with windows in so we can keep a clear visual. Which side of the door would we be on? Well, it depends on the level of risk that we're facing. But what I'd like to see is doors with windows in so we can keep a clear visual. Which side of the door would we be on? Well, it depends on the level of risk that we're facing. Let's not mistake this for a child who wants to leave a classroom, because a lot of the time I'd say, well, yeah, if there's no greater harm going to occur, if there's not a high level of risk on the other side of that door, let them walk out of the classroom, maybe think about where they can go and contain them. Sometimes I've heard about children being able to say, can I go to my safe space or can I go to a timeout room, which is absolutely great. But I've also heard about safe faces. So rather than children knowing that they can just go to a classroom and play Lego and perhaps not take part in a lesson, instead of that, they've got a teacher that if they're having trouble self-regulating, they can leave the classroom and they can go and wait outside that member of staff's door. So there's still rules to it. They can't just barge in, but it means they've got that safety blanket. They've got somewhere that they can go or someone that they can call on. If you also look into the Gareth Myatt serious case review, one of the things it talks about is if Gareth had been locked in his room, instead of being restrained on his bed and struggling until he died from vomit aspiration, he'd still be alive to this day. So anybody that's out there saying that we can't lock doors or we can't create barriers or we should never contain a child in a room or an area, just as level here. There's gates and fences around schools. What do we do with those gates and fences? We lock them. We're considering it as a less intrusive option than having to hold somebody or getting to the point of crisis where they're trying to get out of the school gates or climb over a wall. As always, I welcome your questions, comments and observations on this.
Until next time, viewers.